sure. It's like more trouble than it's worth, honestly. All right, I could do it in a different class if it's not going to work out. Okay. If I skip over something quickly, that's intentional because I either think we've gone over this point a bunch of times, or I think that we've covered it sufficiently for what the College Board is going to ask. So for example, for this first bullet point here, that's just referring to the structure of the federal constitutional courts, which are, as you know, because we've listed this a bunch of times now, the district courts. The country is broken up into different federal district courts, and then the federal courts of appeals, which are sometimes called appellate courts, and then the Supreme Court at the top of that chain. Article 3 of the Constitution calls for the creation of a judicial system. It calls for a Supreme Court, but how that is structured is a creation of Congress. Even the fact that there are 9 Supreme Court justices, that is a creation of Congress. There constitutionally does not have to be 9 Supreme Court judges. That's the number that the country has settled on for over the past 100 years. So that structure is established by Congress. But we do know that the Constitution does outline certain elements of the judicial branch in Article 3, like the fact that judges are nominated by the president and confirmed by the Senate, which we'll talk a little bit more about when we get down here to these checks and insulated. We know that those judges cannot have their salaries reduced, and we know that they serve for life or for good behavior. So they would need to die or retire or go through the impeachment process. They cannot have their job threatened in order to try to manipulate the outcome of cases or to punish them for an unpopular ruling. So that's what we mean by the federal judiciary and how it is structured here. Original jurisdiction means that a case begins in that level. So they are the ones that hear it first. We talked a bit about original jurisdiction when we talked about the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court, for the most part, hears appeals. Cases work their way up to the Supreme Court. There are a few limited instances where the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction, though, where a case would start in the Supreme Court. And that includes things like when one state sues another state, or when a state is in a lawsuit with a citizen of a different state, or when a foreign diplomat is involved in a lawsuit with the United States. That is when the Supreme Court has original jurisdiction. It would start there. Beyond those very limited instances, all the other cases get to the Supreme Court through the appeals process. What do we call it when the Supreme Court decides to hear an appeal? They issue a what? Here I am asking about Latin at 8 o'clock on a Monday.
The writ of certiorari.
Yes, very good. They issue a writ of certiorari. The Supreme Court will issue a writ of certiorari if they feel that your case is of national importance, if they want to set a national precedent, if they want to clarify rulings of the lower courts that differ from one another, and oh my gosh, I was going to say one other thing about it. Now I forget. But yeah, they'll issue a writ of, the rule of 4. If 4 of the justices want to hear the case, they will issue a writ of certiorari. That's just a tradition that's the standard that they've used. So you might hear about the rule of 4. Not actually on our assessment, but it has come up on the AP test before. Appellate jurisdiction, that's what we were just talking about, where you hear appeals. That's what we mean by appellate. What's the main message of the Federalist 78?
Sort of assuring people that the Supreme Court won't get too powerful and that life terms are okay.
Yeah, very well said. Exactly. Some people were concerned about the protections that you just discussed and fearful that that would give the judicial branch too much power. So you're absolutely right. The Federalist 78 talks a lot about ways that the judicial branch is checked and balanced, probably most notably that they have no enforcement power, and assures people that the judicial branch will not gain too much power, that it's okay for justices to have life terms. You're absolutely right. That is the one piece that the Federalist 78 really focuses on. We spent a lot of time talking about Marbury versus Madison. We went on a deep dive into the history of Marbury versus Madison there, but I think the most important thing to note about Marbury versus Madison is that it establishes the concept of judicial review. Arguably, the founding fathers intended for judicial review. It's discussed, not by name, but by concept in the Federalist 78. So what is judicial review? Marbury versus Madison in judicial review is on every single AP test. I mean, it's like their favorite. So any thoughts about what judicial review is? Put an emoji in the chat if you know it, but you just don't feel like talking this morning because you're stressing me out. Okay. All right, fine. Okay, so judicial review is when the Supreme Court can deem a government act unconstitutional, like a law or like an executive order. So you know it, I get it, it's early on a Monday, but you have to know what judicial review is, okay? And that it was established by Marbury versus Madison. In terms of criminal law versus civil law, I've never seen an AP question where they pick this apart. But a criminal law is when you've committed a crime and you have charges pressed against you by the government, whatever level of government that you have violated their policies. Civil law is when one person sues another person or one entity sues another entity, when a person instigates a lawsuit. We spent a little bit of time talking about that. Again, I certainly do not on our quiz, and I don't think on the AP test are they going to ask you to make distinctions between criminal and civil law that would be any more difficult than this person broke a law and that person sued somebody. Let's talk about precedent. Precedent is in some ways a check on the judicial branch because the justices often feel that it is important to maintain precedent. And they refer to that concept as stare decisis. Let the decision stand. Precedent is important. Precedent helps to guide lower court rulings. It helps to guide future Supreme Court rulings. Stare decisis, letting the decision stand, helps to provide us with stability. It'd be a pretty stressful place to live if the Supreme Court changed its mind about big stuff every year or even every couple of years. I was going to use an example, but we'll get into some controversial policy type of stuff later in the year. So yeah, noting the importance of precedent, what precedent is, the value in it, I think that's an important concept for us to understand. Having said that, and like we said the other day, the Supreme Court does not have to adhere to precedent. They see a value in it, and I think we can all see a value in it. But thankfully, the Supreme Court does not always adhere to precedent. In 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson established the precedent that separate but equal is perfectly constitutional, and that you could force people of different races into different facilities, and certainly sometimes the facilities for one race were subpar to the others. Then fast forward to 1954, and a direct turnover of precedent, the Supreme Court said separate but equal is not constitutional. So thankfully, precedent isn't concrete. It can be changed, but there is a value in the consistency of precedent and of letting the decision stand. Sometimes when the Supreme Court overturns precedent, they say that in the majority opinion, like this is a direct turnover of previous precedent. And whenever precedent is changed, that is a response to the culture, a response to the zeitgeist, the spirit of the times. Any thoughts or comments about precedent? It's an important concept. Okay, these next 3 bullet points, let's just talk about them super quickly because these mustard color bullet points, that's what I want to spend a lot of time talking about today because those concepts are really important in general and because I know what's on your quiz this week. Majority opinion is the opinion of the majority of the court. So they're going to explain why they ruled the way they did, lots of constitutional explanation for it, their interpretation of the Constitution as applied to that specific topic. the majority opinion is really important because that becomes part of the precedent. That helps future decision making. A concurring opinion is when you agree with the outcome, but for totally different reasons. So you agree with the way people voted, but you want to be able to explain in your own words how you arrived at that result. You would write a concurring opinion. And a dissenting opinion is written by the people that disagree, the people that voted differently from the majority. They'll explain why they voted that way. So any questions about majority, concurring, or dissenting opinions? All right. In terms of these checked and insulated in judicial restraint and judicial activism, I actually want us to go back in our notes, and let's start with checked and insulated first. Okay. I'm going to go through this list. I'm going to focus on some more than others. There's always a method to my madness, but you need to chime in if any of these require more explanation. If I skim over something that you need more explanation for, then please chime in. Okay, so here are some checks on the court. These are things that prevent the court from getting too powerful. These are also things that have the potential to impact the court's opinion, to help shape the court's opinion. So most notably, they have no enforcement power. If the courts hand down an absolutely wild ruling that is super controversial, it's likely that the executive branch and the president won't enforce it, and that Congress will not pass laws in line with that ruling moving forward. Congress can reword and repass laws. So let's say the Supreme Court deems a law unconstitutional, then Congress can rewrite it and hope that that new language gets approved. That happened with the Gun-Free School Zone Act after the Supreme Court case U.S. v. Lopez. Here's an extreme thing that Congress can do, but it is something that they have done multiple times. They can amend the Constitution. It's the Supreme Court's job to interpret and apply the Constitution, and if Congress amends the Constitution, then that is the new lens through which the Supreme Court has to judge future rulings. So that happened with the 16th Amendment, the collection of a federal income tax. It happened with the 26th Amendment, and saying that states have to allow 18 to 21-year-olds to have the right to vote. The 11th Amendment is like my least favorite, and we've talked a little bit about it before, and we'll get more into it later, but you could even use the 11th Amendment as an example there. These next two are not a super direct way to influence the court, but could certainly change the opinions of the court over time. And that is basically restructuring the federal courts. Like we said, Article 3 calls for a federal court and it calls for Supreme Court, but the way that that is structured is an invention of Congress. And so Congress, in theory, could alter outcomes if it altered that structure. Here's an important one that I want us to focus on. Yes, Supreme Court justices are appointed, which insulates them, right? They don't have to run for re-election. They never have to appeal directly to the people. But they are appointed, nominated by the president, who is an elected official, and they are confirmed by the Senate, which is comprised of elected officials. The president is going to try to choose someone that he thinks will earn a Senate confirmation. The president isn't going to choose someone that is incredibly radical in his or her opinions if he doesn't think that that person's going to get Senate confirmation. So this process, the fact that justices are appointed, that insulates them because they don't have to run for re-election. But the process is kind of a series of checks. Nominated by an elected official, confirmed by elected officials. The president wants to pick someone that is moderate enough to get confirmed by the Senate. The president certainly wants to pick someone that has the appropriate experience and that where the Senate will think that person is qualified for the job. So there's a certain type of person that's going to be picked based on the fact that the president is an elected official and he needs to pick someone that he thinks will earn a Senate confirmation. Questions about how appointed in and of itself is a way that justices are insulated, but that process is kind of a check. There's a reason why I'm harping on that, okay? So do you have questions about it? Okay. Those are checks that are outlined in the Constitution, some checks that exist just based on circumstances. We've already talked about precedent and how people value precedent, stare decisis, let the decision stand. And so in some ways, precedent acts as a check. Again, they do not have to adhere to precedent, and thankfully they don't always adhere to precedent. But we want to live in a country with stability and predictability, and justices understand that, and so they're going to let precedent at least guide future decision making. People can watch the oral arguments. People are allowed in the Supreme Court building to watch oral arguments. The judges read amicus curiae briefs, friends of the court, briefs that are submitted by individuals or interest groups or corporations, any interested party that wants to help shape the outcome of the case. The justices can choose to accept amicus curiae briefs. And then here's another important point. The judges are exposed to culture just like the rest of us are. They don't live in a bubble. The reason why the precedent of Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned is because of changing culture and the court's actually very progressive response to changing culture. They acted before the legislature acted, as we talked about on Friday. So questions about checks before we move on to insulated. All right, so we've already talked about the appointment process and how the fact that they are appointed is a way that they are insulated. But that process where they are nominated by an elected official, where the president wants them to be confirmed by the Senate, which is comprised of elected officials, that process prevents the justices from being incredibly radical people. It keeps them more moderate. But the fact that they're appointed, that in and of itself is a way that they're insulated because they don't have to run for election or re-election. They serve life terms, their salaries cannot be reduced. That's all stuff we've talked a ton about. Are we good there? And then we talked about ways that they are insulated just based on circumstances, not in the Constitution, but no photos or videos during Supreme Court proceedings at all, even during those oral arguments. They meet in private to talk. They don't have to worry that something that they say during those Friday meetings can be used against them. So what questions do you have about checked and insulated before we move on to our last review topic? I was just double checking my list that I wrote while I was looking at the quiz.
Could you reiterate, how the judges being appointed can be a check again?
Yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so the fact that the president requires Senate confirmation is going to keep the president from selecting someone that is too radical or that is too out of line with public opinion. Honestly, it's almost more of a check on the president than it is on the court, if you think about it. But being appointed certainly insulates the justices from public opinion. They don't have to get reelected. But the fact that the president does require Senate confirmation is going to prevent the president from picking someone that is too out of line with public opinion. The president's going to want to pick someone that has the appropriate experience so that the Senate will feel that he or she is qualified. He's going to want to pick someone that he thinks will get confirmed. So it's more directly a check on the president than it is on the justices. But it does keep the court from being filled with really radical, unqualified people.
Okay, thank you.
Sure. All right, and then on Friday, we talked about judicial restraint versus judicial activism. Those are complicated constitutional philosophy type of conversations. So I was very impressed and proud of the conversations that we had on Friday about these two concepts. Let's just go back over what we mean by these two things. So judicial restraint is when people take a more narrow, literal interpretation of the Constitution. Oftentimes, believers in judicial restraint call themselves strict constructionists. They do not want to interpret the Constitution in new ways. They want to apply the Constitution as they felt the authors intended. And judges that consider themselves strict constructionists and judges that believe in judicial restraint are going to want to apply the Constitution to cases in the most straightforward, literal, narrowly interpreted type of way. Believers in judicial restraint are even less likely to utilize judicial review because the Constitution says that Congress makes the laws, and even if the Supreme Court doesn't love that law, a lot of times believers in judicial restraint just defer to Congress. Okay, you made the law, you have the constitutional power to make the laws, we're going to let you make that law. We saw that with certain justices with the Affordable Care Act. And their reasoning for upholding the Affordable Care Act's individual mandate. So questions about judicial restraint or what it means to be a strict constructionist. Believers in judicial activism are going to use the Constitution as a lens through which they view modern day circumstances. So they are more likely to apply their interpretation of the Constitution to modern circumstances. They are more likely to develop new interpretations of the Constitution and new uses for constitutional provisions, like, for example, with the Affordable Care Act case, using the 16th Amendment, which was originally created to give the national government the power to collect an income tax. But in this case, certain justices said that the individual mandate fine is like a tax, and you're allowed to tax because of the 16th Amendment, so you should be allowed to collect this fine. So judicial activism is going to be a wider, broader interpretation of the Constitution, more likely to engage in judicial review, more likely to come up with new uses for constitutional provisions. So questions about judicial activism. Wait, let me check the chat. Yeah, so the reason I made those certain bullet points a different color is because I wanted to talk about them in more depth. It was like a reminder to myself that I definitely wanted to go back over these things in more depth, and I wanted to revisit those slides. So the reasoning for that was twofold, because I think those are some of the biggest takeaways from this chapter, and also because I just looked at the quiz. Other questions before I say one more thing? Okay, if you are, I thought I put them here, but I put them in a separate PDF. Sorry about the clicking around. Here are some review options. You have the notes that you can review from. I'm going to post this recording that you can listen to. You have this list of concepts that you should go back over. And then in today's folder, there is a PDF of review points and then little explanations and ways of processing those concepts. So there's a PDF in today's folder that would also be helpful in terms of review. And you can come to my office hours on Wednesday. Those are all review options. Final questions? Okay, then I will see you back here tomorrow for a quick chat, and then I'll free you up to get started on that free response.